Welcome to the Her Health Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk, where we empower women and girls to take charge of their health and well-being. Join us as we shine a spotlight on issues affecting women and girls' health and explore ways to create positive change. Get ready to be inspired and empowered as we discuss health, advocacy, and empowerment for women and girls at risk. Please be advised that this podcast may cover sensitive topics such as gendered violence. We understand that these discussions can be difficult to listen to. If you feel uncomfortable or need support, we encourage you to prioritize your well-being. Consider exploring our other podcasts if these topics are triggering for you. Resources can be found in the description.
Welcome to the Her Health Podcast, where we kind of explore transformative conversations at the intersection of health, equity, and community, focusing on the well-being of women, girls, and gender diverse people affected by violence and adversity. And today we're joined by Keitu Malatsi, Education Coordinator at Community, a leading BC-based organization that has been working to build inclusive and safer spaces for the 2SLGBTQIA community for over a decade. And in her most recent AVA webinar, Foundations of 2SLGBTQIA Inclusivity, Keitu shared critical tools and knowledge for fostering affirming environments and unpacking gender and sexuality and supporting inclusive practice grounded in intersectionality. So let's dive into the questions. So Keitu, thank you so much for being here. For listeners who may not be familiar with Community, can you tell us a bit about the organization and your role within the education team?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So for folks who are unfamiliar with Community, we are BC's Two-Spirit Queer and Trans Resource Center. We've been around for around 45 years. So we've been doing this work with queer communities in some iteration for quite some time. Our education team's been around for a little over a decade. Um, in terms of what we do, large scale at Q, we offer a range of community services, low barrier community services. So everything from a youth program. Within our youth program, we have things like drop-in, one-on-one casework, as well as things like Rare Prom and fun events and things like that, as well as our gender supportive wear program, where youth can get free gender affirming wear sent to them discreetly throughout the province, or they can get it in person as well if they're based in the Lower Mainland. Um, what else? We have our counseling program, which is pretty robust. It's been running just about as long as Q has been running. We haven't always been named Community as well. So if you're somebody who has a history with BC or has lived in the Lower Mainland, you may have seen various iterations of Community throughout the years. We were the center for a long time before we were Community. We were also the Gay and Lesbian Center in Vancouver for a long time as well. We also have our legal services and our legal clinic. So that's where we run our trans ID clinic, as well as the big umbrella that our legal clinic covers around like housing, employment, family law, and human rights. And in terms of education, we basically build and offer educational resources, whether it's things like trainings, but as well as developing other learning resources. So public legal education, toolkits, brochures, online courses, all of that falls into like our education portfolio. And we basically just build resources on how to make things safer and more inclusive for 2S LGBTQI+ people. And that's our job.
Amazing. Thank you so much for diving in. And you also talked about the community's like Trans ID clinic, which is very unique and a very important resource, very much unique in terms of like coming from Calgary myself. Can you tell us a little bit kind of about more about that support, what it offers and who can access that?
Yeah. So I will say it's for folks who are based in BC. Generally, our services are for folks based in BC because of our mandate as a provincial organization. But it's a clinic we run to help people with some of the administrative things that come with going through a legal name change or a legal gender designation change on folks' documents. So the way the clinic runs is usually folks will either make an appointment. There's 3 clinics a month, and 2 clinics are by appointment. We take about 7 to 8 appointments per clinic, and they run pretty concurrently. We'll have lawyers present as well as volunteers, and we'll help folks with getting the correct forms printed. We'll notarize any documents that they need to notarize. We'll essentially set folks up till the last possible step we can with their application for their legal name change or gender designation change. Often the only step that folks then have to do after is submit their application to Vital Statistics. We also help folks navigate how to find a fee waiver or how to go about getting a fee waiver if they need to do that as well, because all these things also have a cost. So it really helps for folks to be able to do that process with queer lawyers and lawyers who are familiar, but also feel like they understand folks' experience a bit more, or definitely understand people's experience a bit more. Our volunteers are also folks who are quite well versed in helping people with some of the pieces that are a little bit difficult. It's also a space that we find feels a lot safer for folks to do some of that, right? It's very difficult because not a lot of places are you going to go and get support with filling out forms that you may be unfamiliar with, but also get support from folks who understand just what you're going through and how complex it can be navigating these things, and also what are some workarounds around paying for certain things. What are some things you need to know if you're not a citizen, for example, and you want to get some documents changed, your Canadian documents changed, but you haven't had your original citizenship document changed from where you're from. There's a whole bunch of things that it's really difficult for an everyday folks to know, and spaces like this really allow for folks to go through this process with a professional, and they can ask questions. It's really great also for parents who are trying to support their kids or their youth to come with their children and basically go through the process as well, being supported and having an informed space as well. So there's also a drop-in clinic for folks who aren't able to make appointments, who want to come and do the forms and submit. Yeah, but basically we help people get to the furthest point they can get with their applications, and just about any other legal advice they might need in their legal education around what their rights are and what they'll need prior to the session. And often what we'll do for folks who book appointments is we just tell them what you need to bring to your appointment, depending on what you would like done. And it's often along the lines of just bring a piece of ID or the ID that you need changed. And then we'll cover everything else. So we'll print the forms, we'll do everything else, we'll make copies, we'll certify copies, and all those other things. Yeah, and it's been running for quite some time. So it's been a really helpful model. And we're also developing some resources to help folks who are not close to community or can't access the clinic in the same way, basically either build something very similar or at least know how to go through the process themselves independently.
Thank you so much for diving into that and creating a safe space for 2SLGBTQIA folks, but also their community, their family, their friends to also engage in this really important transition into their life. And then I love the idea that these resources of like building this resource to hopefully create a model for different areas to understand like all the work that needs to go into that. I really appreciate you diving into that.
Yeah.
Kind of going forward, your webinar covered a range of foundational topics. So that's like from the terminology to pronouns to inclusive language. Why is this so important for individuals and organizations to kind of start with this as foundation?
Yeah, it's important because a lot of what is in this foundation is really things that are also what we consider foundational to an experience of inclusiveness, right? So these are some of the things that we can consider core tenets of what makes somebody feel a sense of belonging, a sense of inclusion, a sense of community in the different places that they're in, right? It's around, do people know who you are? Do they understand your identity? Have they heard of your identity? Lots of folks are having to do so much labor to educate the people around them about their identities, right? To educate them about what it means to be non-binary, things that are important to them. And again, some of these experiences are quite unique, but there is some learning that it would be great if everybody did this learning and there was kind of a collective benchmark, right, where people knew how important it is to use the correct language, because the impact of using the incorrect language on the worst case is outing folks, making them unsafe. And I don't think folks realize that people lose their jobs when they disclose that they're queer. Like, people lose opportunities, people lose promotions, people don't get offered employment and things like that because of their gender and their sexuality. So it's really, really important that folks do more to learn about these experiences, but to also understand, which is why we also talk about intersectionality and the different ways queer people experience distinct risks and marginalization. It's not just important to know who people are and their identities, but it's also important to know that we live in a society that has structures that also systemically marginalize these groups as well, right? So it's not just about knowing what trans means or what intersex means, but it's also about knowing that trans people are having very fundamentally different relationships to structures around you that you yourself, as somebody who doesn't hold that identity, are not familiar with. And the thing with privilege is that privilege is like blinders, right? So it's like when you have your privilege, you don't see the things that other folks don't have. So if you're somebody who's never had to have a name change, you don't see what it's like for folks who have to change their name and have folks use a different name, and how people just won't, right? Like, and it's something that's so important to somebody. How you name yourself, how you identify yourself, is such an essential part of who you are. And so that's not an experience that folks will know, and so they'll be blind to like what the impact is as well. So we really do this work because, or I do this work anyway, because I hope that I can plant seeds, right? And our Indigenous coordinator, Adrian, before they left their role, spoke a lot about this, about planting seeds, and really about, there's lots of things I can't do. There's lots of things as individuals we won't be able to change in our workplaces and our communities. However, we can plant seeds and collectively start to get people more connected to learning. If I can get somebody to even think about, oh, this reminds me of, I need to go read about this because my friend's daughter or my friend's child is going through this experience and I want to be able to support her. Or, oh, I didn't even realize I've made this comment before, or I say things like this, or I identify this behavior and now I know that it's actually not okay. And I'm just planting those seeds so that people can really start to make those changes gradually in their everyday lives, and really fostering change in that way, and working towards some kind of sustainable model for transformative change, right? So that people can be in spaces and move with some degree of dignity and respect, even if there isn't necessarily understanding all the time, but that there's always going to be dignity and respect and an earnest effort to make sure that everybody knows that the structures exist in place to keep them safe as well. A workplace where people really feel like they can say, hey, this is happening, it's important. Or people knowing that they can say to their professor, you said this thing and that's not okay, or it's not sitting well with me, and knowing that, oh, this is a space actually to somebody who's receptive to feedback and can apologize, and now we can also hold them accountable because they know now that this behavior isn't okay. So that's why I do this work, and like why I think it's foundational, like why some of these foundational things are important, because it really is about the foundations people need in everyday spaces, essentially, to be able to move with a little bit more safety, a little bit more comfort, and a little bit more belonging. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, planting the seeds of dignity and respect is something that I think here at AVA we try to do as well when it comes to talking about violence and adversity. And I really love that metaphor going forward. And I feel like I'll start saying it a lot. So thank you. And I hope you won't trademark me for that.
No, I won't. It's not mine. I'm using it from my coworker as well. So
You've touched on that learning is really important as kind of when we talk being inclusive, and kind of there are like unintentional harms when we enter unsafe spaces or talk to individuals in unsafe spaces. So I was wondering if you could kind of speak a little bit more to common misconceptions or unintentional harms that people might bring into spaces when they are unfamiliar with 2SLGBTQIA identities or experiences.
okay. Whew, there's a couple of things that happen. So one I'll name that's pretty common, which kind of alluded to in the webinar, but didn't speak to directly, is that often, because folks can be well-intentioned, and a lot of folks can also feel like they're in a place where they've done quite a bit of learning, for example, there tends to be a strange sort of defensiveness or inappropriate over justification that happens when people name harm. And that often ends up being like unintentionally harmful in itself, right? This thing of you're trying to tell somebody that they're engaging in behavior that is not inclusive, but in their head, they're incapable of doing that behavior consciously. Therefore, they feel like they shouldn't be held accountable for something that they are not doing on purpose, for example, right? And if we can't be in a place where we can talk about like impact and how to move forward and recognizing that you are going to mess up. Yes, you're going to mess up, you're going to make mistakes. That is part of the learning. And that there's going to be things that are uncomfortable. There's going to be moments when you're going to have to be called in, and that'll be uncomfortable.
Mhm.
And I find that a lot of harm can live in that place where people are not receptive to feedback, not receptive to changing their behavior, or rather not receptive to accepting that this could be something that they're unintentionally doing, that they're unintentionally harming queer folk. So that's a thing that happens. But also another thing that happens is that people will assume that spaces are really punitive, that you can't make mistakes, therefore they won't work with. So let's take, for example, service providers. I see service providers all the time who themselves, because they're not queer, they feel like they can't work with queer people because they feel like, oh, they should have somebody who's queer because then that person is, more likely to be able to support them in a better way. The reality is that queer people are just as capable of harm as folks who are not queer towards queer people, right? Like, it's being queer doesn't also necessarily mean that somebody's going to have a fundamentally better experience with a queer service provider than they would with a non-queer service provider. But often what happens in this kind of myth of expertise, where a lot of people actually, that myth is based in this fragility thing of like being afraid to make mistakes, being afraid to learn, is that we end up with a massive gap or shortage in services, right? Like if every other social worker basically feels uncomfortable to some extent working with trans folk, that leaves the very, very few, almost slim to none trans social workers to work with all the trans folks that need a social worker. Like that ends up being like disproportionately harming and causing burnout for queer people, right? So we see it play out in so many different cyclical ways, and a lot of it really comes down to everybody is responsible for this in some shape or form. In the same way that we uphold these systems of belief, in the same way we uphold cisnormativity and heteronormativity, and also benefit from these systems, that means that everybody's, queer or not, everybody's responsible for the dismantling, for the unlearning, and also for moving towards a different place, right? Of the building new norms that are deviating from these norms that we've set and reinforced for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So
Mhm.
often I think a lot of folks get caught up in this place of, I don't think I can do it. I don't think I'm the person to do it. And a lot of the time also I'll say to them, that just sounds like you don't want to do it, because you can. Everybody can. You don't need to be an expert on something to be able to support somebody appropriately. And it's actually a big misconception for folks to think that they need to be in this place of extraordinary learning or extraordinary knowing to be able to work with people. And often actually when harm is caused unintentionally and it's really truly unintentional, so much grace is extended. I think I don't understand why this has happened where people feel like they can't do things, because I think queer people extend so much grace to the people around them all the time. So many people extend so much grace to people misgendering them or adjusting to a name change, or misgendering them because of gender attribution, because they're presenting in a particular way and they don't make a big things, they don't do a lot. So I think it's also strange that a lot of this has come about, because I think there's lots of grace and room given to people to really learn, and that when harm happens and it is unintentional, but that apology and accountability is intentional and is sincere, lots of good can happen there. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, absolutely. I learned a lot, like a different kind of aspect of unintentional harms and how everyone is responsible and everyone should be continuous learners. And thank you for really emphasizing that point that either if we're too scared to actually have these conversations, or to feel like even for service providers to not provide support because they just don't feel like they know enough, is still harming the community. So I
Yeah.
really appreciate it. Kind of going back into kind of intersectionality was a key kind of theme in your session. How does having like an intersectional lens help us better understand and support the needs of 2S LGBTQIA communities, and especially in kind of healthcare or social services settings?
Yeah. It's foundational. Intersectionality is foundational as like a framework to, I would say, quite literally any lane of activism or anything adjacent to basically supporting marginalized groups, because intersectionality is the thing that asks us to think about, I'm not just vulnerable because I'm queer, I'm also vulnerable because I'm queer and Black, and also that means being queer and Black in Canada positions me in a particular way, or I am trans and femme and low income. So even though there's aspects of my identity where I might be experiencing some degree of privilege, all of us in some shape or form experience some degree of privilege, depending on what parts of our identities we hold. There is a real part of me that really has a much closer relationship to vulnerability and to things like policing and just inequity, right? So intersectionality allows us to really think about how do we think about wraparound services. Not everybody's going to do wraparound services, and that isn't the expectation. But the expectation is for folks to understand that if you are going to be working with 2SLGBTQIA plus people, intersectionality allows you to also really think about, okay, what are the distinct risks that somebody's experiencing? Like, what is their relationship in the context of, if you're somebody who's working with trans youth in Calgary, you are working with an extremely vulnerable group, right? Like, they're vulnerable youth of a vulnerable population across the country, but youth in places where the rights of trans youth are being targeted, trans youth in those areas are like extremely vulnerable. Extremely vulnerable in interpersonal settings in terms of the types of relationships people are even able to have in their homes or their communities, if they can have them. So in service provision or in healthcare settings, folks are often exploited, right? Or their needs are ignored. Lots of medical negligence can happen. And this is all, again, because people either A, don't care to make sure that their services are inclusive, B, get into this place of feeling that they're not experts, therefore not supporting people, which means that then a lot of people have to basically self-advocate and navigate the world being their own champion essentially all the time. Whereas if somebody just adopts an intersectional lens, they might realize that, oh, actually, somebody being trans does give them a very different relationship with vulnerability and structures of oppression. So I actually do have to make sure that their care is more complex because their needs are more complex. It's not going to be like how I might consider or how I might approach care for somebody who is cis and also has lots of wealth. There's even trans youth who have supportive families. Their experience of getting gender affirming care is so fundamentally different from youth who don't have supportive families, for example, right? So those youth that don't have supportive families, more so than the youth with supportive families, need healthcare practitioners and service providers who are going to validate their experiences, find affirming services for them, but also make sure that they know that their needs are complex and that they're willing to make sure that they can build things that make the most sense for them. And the reality is that this work means a lot of building. So if you're somebody who's going to now more increasingly be engaging with queer communities, you're going to need to more increasingly engage in learning and in systems change. And if you're really going to say this space is trans inclusive, what does that mean? We need to see it in policy. We need to see it in action. We also need to see what it looks like for folks who don't necessarily align with that, right? Seeing lots of centers also navigating this line, particularly anti-violence centers that have historically, because the feminist movement, been very feminine spaces or spaces with a lot of cis women. Attempting now to really move towards a more trans-inclusive space, right? However, for them to get to that trans-inclusive space, there's a lot of learning around what they've learned, even in feminist rhetoric that is actually anti-trans, that they now have to unlearn, right? Lots of what they've learned actually that is internalized misogyny that they have to unlearn basically to make those services. And a lot that they have to now tell clients and people who are accessing their services that like, this is changing. That means that the folks who come here are changing. That means that the services here are going to look different. And that is also something that's okay. So I think when we adopt an intersectional lens, it's really all around, it's all about looking at the different ways people need different support. It's not really about, I want to make sure that I do this thing for Pride Month, and I want to make sure that we do this thing for Black History Month. I want to make sure we do this thing. No, because people are queer and racialized and all these things throughout the year. It's really about, okay, so when I'm building a resource list, when I'm building resource list for folks around spousal supports for people in your workplace. Consider spousal supports that are also diverse. And also consider that intimate partner violence looks very different and how that looks as well. So it's really all the ways in which where somebody's thinking may usually stop at step 1, 2, or 3. Intersectionality says step 1, what's the context? Step 2, what's the context? Step 3, what's the context? And if you do even that extra step, you'll find that there's something that was always missing that can then be added, something that was missing that can then be added, and that makes the service a lot more accessible, removes barriers for folks. And that's generally why I think it's important. It's really, really foundational.
Thank you so much for diving into that. I really appreciate it. Kind of talking in more of an allyship area, you mentioned like building and advocating for 2SLGBTQ communities. You spoke very much about flagging allyship. So what is it, what does meaningful allyship look like in practice? And how can someone kind of move from that ambiguous acceptance to or tolerance that you mentioned to like active full acceptance and advocacy?
One is the big thing is going to be labor. That's the thing that a lot of allies or a lot of folks who call themselves allies have strayed away from is labor. It's more so that folks will kind of now be in this place of I accept people, but there isn't necessarily any labor behind what that acceptance means, right? Because it's one thing to accept that you want people to have the rights that they are entitled to and to live their lives in ways that feel the most authentic for them. But it's another thing to then realize also people cannot do that as long as we live in societies that have systems that marginalize them, right? Like people can't outwardly do the things that they want to do in the same ways if they're living in structures that will punish them for doing that, right? Like you can't. So it's really like allyship is about what to then do to change that reality, It's very easy for folks to say, oh, I love this. Like you should just do what you want and come to work dressed like this. But then people are being disciplined for wearing makeup, but not being very presenting or something. There's all kinds of hidden and unspoken sort of harm that happens that people have to constantly navigate. It's really a strange kind of negotiation where people are constantly doing with the different contexts in their life to basically figure out what version of myself can be the most safe here, what version of myself can be the most safe in this place. And allies are really, the work should be around every single place I'm at, every single space I'm in. I'm going to then try and see what is the reality for queer folk here? How can I make that reality different? How can I make it better? How can I improve it? And some things are going to be small gestures like flagging. You might be in a place where there's a lot of the culture is not as tolerant, right? So let's say if you're living in a town or a city where the culture on the large is not tolerant, things like flagging then become quite a big deal, right? It becomes a bigger deal when you then have a flag or you have a rainbow crosswalk and things like that. So we know also that there's certain places where some other allyship, like flagging allyship, that might be more of a gesture in places that are more tolerant, actually then becomes some of advocacy in different contexts as well, where there's less tolerance. And we can see that it's important because people will deface these symbols of acceptance or these symbols of tolerance as well, right? So it's also really going to be around what exists around you. I always tell people with allyship, folks get really caught up in just wanting to signal to other people that, hey, I'm participating in this allyship thing. But really, it should start local, like start small, start with your friends, start with your loved ones, start with your workplace, start with your community, start there, because the more people can have safer neighborhoods, safer communities, find little pockets, help somebody resource their peer group or start a peer group, right? There's some peer groups that aren't even started by queer folk themselves, but it's from folks who support queer people in their life, and they realized, oh, I should do this for other people. You know, there's a group called Trans and Loved Ones, which was started by folks who wanted to have a peer group space that was for trans people who could then bring their loved ones to have conversations about what is the difficult things they're navigating with having somebody recently transition who's a loved one. So we're talking about a parent being able to go with their child to talk to other parents who've had their children, a partner going with their partner to talk with other couples that have navigated a transition in their relationship. And it can seem like, oh, this is just like a talking space, but it's important. There's so little spaces where people can talk and ask questions and have these environments and cultivate these environments, right? So, and all it took was somebody being like, this space needs to exist. They advocated for it, found a structure to do it, started it, volunteer led. Everybody who's doing it is doing it voluntarily on their free time because they see the need for it to exist and its importance, right? So it's going to be a lot of labor. It's supposed to be work. Allyship is supposed to be work. Queer people are not exempt from this work either, right? Lots of folks walk around being happy, happy queer. The only reason you can be happy, happy queer is because other queer people had to literally put their bodies and lives on the line so that we could be where we are today, right? And so it's our responsibility to keep making sure that we are making it so that queer people 10 years from now have really different experiences from us, that they don't have to have the same concerns, they don't have to navigate systems in the same way, they don't have to have the same fears, right? We're like, really, this is work that has been done for generations, and we're really about making movement towards getting better. And it swings. Like, we don't really get to control the motion of whether people are more tolerant or less tolerant. And so allyship also demands labor and consistency. That's what it demands. And not everybody is also going to be an advocate. That's the thing with advocacy as well. Sometimes also allyship is going to remain as just like active allyship, sustainable, helping your community members. It's not going to mean that you're an advocate who's at the front, starting the things, doing the things all the time. That's not something that's accessible to everyone. That's also okay. It's realizing that you are doing everything you can rather than just calling yourself an ally and doing literally nothing. And that's the thing. It's not okay. We need more allies, but don't call yourself an ally if there isn't any labor attached to it, right? You can just say, like, I'm in a place where I'm not able to actually be an ally to folks because I'm burnt out. I'm navigating my own refugee claim. I'm doing all these things. There are other aspects of my life that prohibit me from being able to be in a practice of allyship or find active allyship in this moment with queer people. But then just say, but I am accepting and I want people to be able to do this. And when I have capacity, I want to engage in allyship and advocacy in any shape or form. So it's really do the work. I feel like that's the thing that folks have been saying, but like really do the work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for diving into that. A little bit of an anecdote to hopefully like raises your spirits. My roommate actually kind of noticed that there wasn't a book club related to like sapphic or queer romances. So they were able to like create a little like lavender club of different 2SLGBTQ individuals across like the city to then come meet once a month and like read sapphic love stories. And I just see like their whole attitude change, that they're able to kind of connect with the community in Calgary where there's not a lot of activities to bring people together like that. So I think like it's doing that, and then myself going to like their market to support themselves and just them feeling like so loved and appreciated. It's just one of the things that just made their life a lot like so much happier and brighter and something to look forward to. So I thought that was really, it's just like a small little story to tell. And yeah.
That's Thanks. Yeah, that's wonderful. And like things like that are so beautiful to hear and so lovely for folks to have around them. Because also sometimes we always are talking about the social service of it all because people do need more social services, but also being able to have a community, have friends, have places where you can engage in things that you want to do is also just as important.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. And then lastly, for folks kind of looking to continue learning or bringing this work into their communities, their institutions, where do you kind of recommend they begin?
Ooh, where do I recommend people begin? That's a great question. What to begin is what exists. So, if you're, for example, looking at it in the context of your university that you're at, where you're wanting to get involved, what exists? Is there a student pride club? Is there a student space that has predominantly supported queer people? Is there a social justice space, things like that? What exists? Go to those spaces, see if there's gaps that align with your skills and things that you can do and be of service there, right? So sometimes everybody also wants to be, in this particular age of everybody's a content creator, nobody is a content consumer. Everybody also wants to be like the person to start the thing and not necessarily the person to join a thing. Join things, be somebody who's part of a larger thing. Doesn't always have to be that every day everybody's a champion of things or starting new things. Bolster the things that exist. If services can get significant and consistent volunteer bodies and funding streams, people can run things that are pretty life essential and life-saving for folks. So it's important that folks do that. Is there a crisis line that you could volunteer with if you have the time to do? Things like that are quite important, especially in this moment as well, where as we continue to see more anti-queer sentiments, we're also going to see queer people start to access some of these things a bit more. Like, we know our calls have basically quadrupled since like last year in terms of like calls to our front desks to support trans folk because of things that are happening. So it's important now that we have volunteers who are answering the phone all the time, or we have folks working in the different call lines that exist as well across the country that really help people with urgent things and crisis response. So in terms of where to begin, start with what's already there. And then if there's nothing there, then you can start something, right? Sometimes it does happen that there's nothing there and there's a very particular thing that you're hoping to do. Then you might have to start the thing. The big thing with that as well, don't do things alone. Find people who want to do it. We're almost never the only person who wants to do something, but sometimes we can think that, but that's not always true. So I really hope folks that people will also realize you don't have to do this work in isolation. You can and you should also be asking for collaborators. Sometimes that can look quite creative. It might not be people you are expecting, people near you. It may be that you need to then make new connections to do this work with other people. But we are because we have community. That's how we exist, because we have community. So work doesn't have to be done in isolation. So start with what's already there. And if something isn't there, find your people, make it happen. And also, when you're finding those people, have some diversity, please. Have some diversity. That's a big one that people sometimes miss as well. And then that it can defeat the purpose sometimes of a space. So also be intentional with, if you are going to be somebody who's building a space, or if you're going to be joining a particular pride space. This has been a critique, for example, I've had for pride spaces in BC sometimes, is they can be so few like racialized folks in some of these spaces that it can feel hard for folks who are visibly racialized to be able to go into some of these queer organizing groups and feel part of them, because historically and presently they don't have a lot of representation. And so that means that or groups and things need to intentionally also be wanting to make spaces better and more inclusive of all kinds of queer people, and not just one particular type of queer person as well, right? Because also trans women of color have experienced some of the highest rates of violence, harassment. For a long time, also Black trans women had the lowest life expectancy in North America, right? So there's all these things that trans spaces might exist. And if you go to that trans space and you're a Black person or Black trans woman and you don't see a single Black person, you might walk right out, because that can signal to you that, like, yeah, folks here just won't get it because it's such a different experience that you're having, right? So it's also representation and diversity is also very important in these things as well. So start with what exists. If you're making something, be diverse, don't do it alone. That's what I'll say.
Thank you. Those are very actionable like steps and a very fulsome answer. Thank you so much for diving into that. Keitu, was there anything else that you feel like that was missing, or you would like to add a little bit more today?
No, I will say that keep doing more. Like, if you've watched the webinar and now you're listening to the podcast, just realize this is only like 2 hours of your time. And if you're somebody who's really in earnest wanting to learn, it's going to take a lot more than that. And I really hope folks realize that as well, is that this is just step one of many, or step 7 in a long journey. But just keep going, keep going.
Well, thank you so much. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah. And folks are welcome to reach out to community if they ever have any questions. Mind Map is also an online resource community holds that has a bunch of resources on there as well. So
Thanks for joining us on the Her Health podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk. Remember, your health matters, and together we can make a difference. Until next time, remember to prioritize your health and well-being. For more resources and support on issues affecting girls, women, and gender-diverse people, visit our website at avatraining.ca. This is Dr. Nicole Letourneau. Thank you for listening.